Hello and welcome to this episode of The Defenders on Sunset TV, in which we will look at one of the major responsibilities of India's land forces, particularly to guard the frontiers of India, and what defensive battles and offensive defense battles would imply in today's scenario. In the 1971 war, the Indian Armed Forces warded off some of the most well-armed and heavily equipped forces of Pakistan in their offensives at Chham and Longewala. It was the sheer grit of India's soldiers that changed the course of those battles and the entire context of India's defensive operations in India's western sector. But today, warfare has changed, and this implies a combination of a number of arms, equipment and services to provide India's armed forces the ability to defend India's front line from the boundaries of Gujarat and Rajasthan through Punjab and onto J&K. And these operations require a great deal of synergy between the land forces and the Air Force and India's army and the paramilitary forces. New equipment has also come into play, enhancing the capability of the defender, like India's armed forces, to inflict considerably more damage on an offensive force that Pakistan might hope to launch. And in this episode, over the next half an hour, we will discuss how these operational scenarios could pan out and what could be the outcome. To discuss the operations that could unfold on India's western front, which borders Pakistan, we have two hands-on and informed experts who have studied the subject, who have written about it, and who have commanded frontline troops on India and Pakistan's borders. We have with us Major General Dwivedi, who is your classic soldier scholar, having commanded troops both on the J&K front and now the Ladakh front, like the LAC, Siachen, and also in India's northeast. He has also considerable military experience of the 1971 war, where he, as a young officer with his Jat battalion, moved forward into East Pakistan and saw firsthand the synergy that is required between the army and the Air Force to achieve the objectives. General Dwivedi has since done some 5 odd postgraduate qualifications and continues to head projects and write books, but that is a separate area of expertise. And we have with us Air Marshal R.K. Sharma, former Vice Chief of the Air Staff, was a test pilot with the Air Force, and basically a combat pilot who has flown all types of variants that the Air Force boasts about and has considerable experience of operational activities that the Air Force undertakes. So I'd like to start with you, Air Marshal sir. 1971 war, to me as a student of history, is really a feather in the Air Force's cap. And had it not been for the dramatic role played by the Indian Air Force, first to demolish the Pakistani Air Force from East Pakistan's skies between 7th, 8th December or thereabouts in 1971, I think one odd lucky bombing streak also altered the equation just before the surrender. But in the case of India-Pakistan now, the Air Force has some commands which are looking specifically at Pakistan and the role that they would be required to play, other than the Balakot type strike, in the event of the Indian government deciding that enough is enough with a terror strike like 26/11 and that let's launch our forces. So there is a great deal of synergy that would be required once again between the Air Force and the Army. Could you outline the big pictures?
Yeah, sure. Okay, we first start with that 1971 war air action. Actually, students of history and air power would see the war on Eastern Front and the war on the Western Front as two different wars.
Absolutely.
Right? Okay, it was one war, India-Pakistan war, but air action wise, there are plenty of lessons that have over the years been drawn, studied by the, air war practitioners insofar as West was concerned and how East was dealt with. So that's that part. So people should understand that. Okay, so the Air Force is one composite whole. It's not as if there are some squadrons against in Western Air Command and some Southwestern Air Command, some Central Air Command, some Eastern Air Command or what. You have to look at the Air Force as one entity. It depends upon where you want to bring about the pressure on the enemy. What is the sort of joint plan that has been created with the Army, land forces, I will say. And therefore, with respect to the joint plan, how do you use your air assets? Now, it doesn't matter if an asset that I need to use is sitting in Gwalior or Bareilly or Hashimara. If that is required to be used, it will switch and we'll use it. So the crux of the whole thing, you use the word synergy. Synergy is not a given. There are no sort of tools to say, okay, I can make this more synergistic and 2 plus 2 will become 5. It doesn't work like that. Synergy occurs as a byproduct of good and effective joint planning.
Yes.
So if you have a good joint plan, you will have synergy. And the word effective, is a very all-encompassing word because there are many elements to an effective joint plan. So that is insofar. So how will the air assets be used? It will be used on the basis of a joint plan. These are discussed at the level of the headquarters of land forces and air forces, etc. everywhere. That's a standard procedure. It's nothing new to, India. And once you have that, then you create the pressures, you do the offensive, where you need to do holding, you do holding and defensive, offensive. So it is something that is,
okay, so
very
you broadly laid out the verticals and the contours within which the land and air forces operate. And General Dwivedi sir, as a scholar, in as much as a soldier, your experience of 71, how you felt the presence of Air Force was, among other things, a morale booster for the ground forces, and how they created a conducive environment for some of the battles, if not all, to have the momentum to move forward rapidly. Please explain.
Well, Marouk, firstly, let me start that today we are in the era of limited wars. And Bangladesh was a classic limited war where you have very set, tailored objectives. And as the Air Marshal mentioned that we need to look at the both Eastern and Western front as one whole because it was a 71 war fought on two fronts. So if you take India's strategic objectives, it was the liberation of Bangladesh on the east and hold on as a strategic defense or offensive defense in the west. So that's the larger picture.
And a third one, as per a CIA noting, was to destroy Pakistan's air and armor capabilities.
Of course, because when in the war, the first and foremost is the destroying the potential of the adversary.
G.
Later on, automatically once you have destroyed the potential, then rest of the things fall in place, right? Now coming to the Bangladesh war and the role of the Air Force, we look at the battlefield as one integrated. It is the air-land. We don't look at the two entities. We look at the one entity. And before planning comes a lot of training. Because when you train, then only you can execute the plans. So therefore, joint training is a prelude to any success when you talk of air, army, navy synergy. So to that extent, I think as an infantryman, once you have your artillery with you, you have the air with you, it's a very big morale booster. Because infantry can't fight on their own. You have to shape the battlefield. So Air Force did shape the battlefield by about 7th, 8th of December. Air Force of Pakistan in the Eastern Theatre had ceased to exist. So therefore we could have a free run. And in fact today, is a very important day for me if I go back by half a century, because we captured Comela single-handed by our battalion, and it was possible. We had 40 kilometers of march before we entered Comela. It was possible because there was no air interference. So what I want to say is the ground operations are largely dependent upon how the battlefield have been shaped and how we are dominating the air. So that was one of the very important, as you know, fact that led to the very quick victory, because had Pakistani Air Force in the Eastern Theatre been active, we would not have been able to achieve this victory in 14 days.
Yes, very, very true. That is a given. I think there's no debate about that amongst historians. Air Marshal sir, one of the issues that is now being talked about, and the General touched upon it also, that future conflicts are going to be limited time span of conflict. It had Bangladesh over 14 days, 15 days. Now it wouldn't be probably even 7 days. So in that kind of scenario, two questions. One is, at what stage do you see the Air Force becoming involved in the event that we go in for at least limited offensive defense operations like a cold start operation? And two, how does the Air Force synergize the speed with which it operates with that of the PBI, the infantryman who moves at 4 kilometers an hour?
Yeah, very, very relevant points. First off, I'll tell you that, I mean, I don't have a crystal ball to suggest where tomorrow's war, as you said, could be 7 days. We prepare for the worst case scenario, at least in the Air Force. We have scenarios for various 7 days, 15 days, 30 days, and what else after that? Well, I can't disclose that part.
Absolutely.
Suffice to say that if it has to be longer drawn than 7 days, we are prepared for it. Okay, so that's one part. The other is how does the Air Force prepare in case of tomorrow's war? You're absolutely right. When does the Air Force come in? Air Force comes in before force on force, engagement takes place. It must come in before that. The single most important, most essential ingredient of being able to take offensive action and indeed to be able to defend yourselves well is ISR capability. That is, actionable intelligence, timely intelligence, surveillance and recce.
Right.
What you do with this ISR capability, you draw what is known as an enemy's orbit. That is a physical orbit of the ground forces. For the public, where are his tank concentrations? Where is his armor? Where is his concentrations of his field artillery? Where is he grouping? What is the kind of breakout he wants to make? Where will his attack axis move from and into our territory? So all these things have to be analyzed, and the enemy orbit, the physical orbit on the ground, his electronic orbit, his surface-to-air missile system orbit, all these have to be analyzed upfront, taken into cognizance, and thereafter you will start your joint plans, right? The responsibility of the Air Force is to participate in establishing this orbit, and that's why I said upfront, before force and force merge takes place. So unless you are, of course, surprised in a particular sector, that can always happen, but you always have contingency plans for that. So the Air Force comes up straight. Now, what assets you use? It is not necessary to use only aeroplanes to do ISR.
Right.
Today you have very, very capable UAVs, you have satellites out there, and you have human and lots of other things are there. So you draw this and you start the action. Cold start, wherever, look, I am not knowledgeable on the cold start doctrine. I have some information that is there in public domain.
Yes,
for whatever
I know, and there has been also a
can,
certain element of denial by the army that it exists, but anyway, let's assume it exists.
Well, having been a CNC of the Eastern Air Force at one time, I can tell you, like say for Western and Southwestern Air Forces also, that all of these doctrinal aspects which manifest itself into tactical aspects. See, doctrine is one, but how does it happen on the ground? Well, that is the tactics part of it. All of them have been jointly, discussed with their counterparts in the Air Force.
Yes.
So it's all there.
Yeah.
So it's not something, that we will be surprised with, oh, cold start has to take place. Now, how do we come in? We know how to go in. We know what is the sort of tactics that will be followed by the army commands on ground. Also, that being said, it is not as if your adversary is going to be caught off guard.
Gee.
They're very well knowledgeable. Look, today the battlefields, General talked about shaping the battlefield. The moment you start shaping the battlefield, the enemy is very much aware. It's very, very transparent. This is not 1971. These are not the wars that were fought in the last 2 decades. The new era of wars makes the battlefield very transparent.
Absolutely.
Except for, of course, one can go into the nitty-gritties, missile warfare, those sort of things, where there is a lot of element of surprise. So there is a lot of transparency, and be sure that the enemy is also watching just as much as you're watching.
True.
And he's going to take notice of this, and he will thwart your efforts.
Right.
So air involvement is straight away. There is nothing like it will come 3 days later, 4 days later. The important question is not that. Important question is, what will the Air Force do in the first 3-4 days of warfare? That is the important question, and that if we have time, we can discuss.
The next question will be on that. General Dwivedi, sir.
Right.
Now, to go take further from the Air Marshal's point, since the Air Force is involved in training, in the integration, in the whole process of war gaming and everything that happens, can you throw some light on earlier, and I have a little experience of that myself, that we had the holding formations that were held on to the border and every piece of sovereign territory, and in the event of a conflict, you held the enemy back as you did in, say, Longewala or Chham, and then quickly brought in your reserves or your strike formations to alter the course of land warfare, and you asked for air support as the Air Force altered the entire story in Longewala when they came in. How would it happen now? There is this talk about integrated battle groups. There is this talk about cold start and a whole lot of composite elements that come into the cold start formations. You would have the spectrum of conflict changing with radar systems, mobile artillery. You have, as the Air Marshals brought out, assets with the Air Force. So everything moves at double quick time now compared to what had happened in your era as a young officer. Could you explain?
Well, firstly, let me throw some light as to how, in today's context, the war are orchestrated. Lot happens before they actually start shooting, because today we are talking about the network-centric warfare, and the whole game is how much information you can collect on the across and how much you can deny, because that's where the lot of shaping takes place before actually shooting starts. So that is the point number one. Secondly, as the you got to hit the ground running. Today there's no warm-up time. A moment you decide, and the wars can actually take shape in a number of ways. It can be a graduated response, or it can suddenly from the ladder 1 and 2 can go to ladder 9. Let's say Galwan. It could be suddenly from ladder 2 to ladder 9, the shooting can start. So therefore, there is no such time as to warm up. You have to be fully prepared. And today we are not talking about a very distinct role in the holding and strike formation. I have served in both. Today, within the holding formation, there is enough offensive capability. That is that within very short time, I can't indicate the time frame.
I'm aware.
But within very short time, you can actually kick off and go for the shallow objectives. And in limited wars, we are not talking about deep objective. We are talking about shallow objective, because today, a tactical objective has strategic implications. After what is Galwan? There is nothing, but it makes lot of noise. It makes lot of sensitivity, or even Kalash range. So you go for the tactical objectives, which will give you strategic payoffs. As far as Air Force is concerned, well, they have two roles. One is strategic, which as infantryman or as the ground formation, we will not be getting the feel of it. We will only get the effect after a few days. But then is the close support, which is right there with the attack helicopters, with the fighter sorties, which are very important, because you see the Western theatre is a predominantly mechanized warfare. And mechanized warfare requires the Air Force to dominate the mechanized formations.
Right. No, very true, sir. And in fact, the Air Force can also play merry hell with the mechanized formations of the enemy, as we saw in Longewala.
Yes.
When they came in, it ended up creating a graveyard for Pakistani
It was known
tanks.
as turkey shooting because they didn't have the air cover, and our hunters took them on like partridges.
Yes. And I want to go, Air Marshals, a little further from that, that taking the example of Longewala as a perfect example of infantryman and airman synergy, because here you had 100-odd men defending a post and desperately wanting air support, otherwise things could have gone completely different in a different direction. In today's context, one thing strikes me, that when you look at the Kargil conflict, in the Kargil conflict, the Air Force again, after some debate, came in as a game changer. And what the Air Force was to do, and the guidelines laid out as the terms of reference of the conflict by Prime Minister Vajpayee, who says don't cross the LOC. So, as having been a fighter pilot, a combat pilot at various stages, how important it is for the Air Force to ensure that it doesn't cross into the enemy's airspace, because Pakistan now has modified its usage of tactical or other nuclear weapons as a term of reference to say that if our airspace is violated, we will still consider the use of nuclear weapons. And it was not just if our territorial sovereignty is violated. Your thoughts, sir?
Okay. So tomorrow's wars are not going to be fought the way we fought yesterday's war.
True.
Right? I don't have to, I mean, the Air Force doesn't have to cross the LC or the IB to be able to hit the enemy. You can do it from 20, 30, 40 kilometers away from our own territory.
Right.
It's not a big deal anymore. The kind of weaponry that the Air Force has today, you know, something was done from 200 kilometers away, Balakot, for example. So it's not a, you know, in tomorrow's wars, it is quite likely that the infantry on the ground will not even see the Air Force. There are going to be no dive attacks and out there gun attacks and rocket attacks, much less than what happened in 71. So tomorrow's wars is going to be very rapid, very fast. The decision making is going to be extremely rapid, precisely for the reason what General said is the net-centric warfare. And that has been in the Air Force for the last decade now. We are only fine-tuning it. Sensor to shooter times have reduced drastically. You know, it's not as if somebody goes and searches for targets, and then there is, you know, somebody who tells you, okay, this is the forward edge of battle area, this is where my troops are, this is those troops are. Everything is on 6 DOF GPS coordinates. And for 6 degree GPS coordinates, you can get a 3-meter accuracy from 20, 30, 40 kilometers away. So it's not a big deal. So the point is not that. Point is, where in the joint plan does the land force want to create a pressure, create a breakout, create a diversion, create a decoy? These plans ought to be known across the commands.
True.
And which is, the system exists, by the way.
True.
It is already being done. So it's not something that I'm talking which must happen from now onwards. So all of it is there. You know, there's an important point that you brought about the issue of surface friction. You had said 4 kilometers or whatever. Well, that is the way land forces operate. They have that restriction, but it is okay. That doesn't mean that an Air Force aircraft which is flying 1,000 kilometers can't support. We don't have to win a particular objective in a battle by being overhead the infantry. That's the point I'm trying to make. What happened in Longewala? Longewala, quite rightly, it was Turkey shoot for the simple reason because their armor thought that they're already in India and they can just have to go and capture a, you know, on the axis and that will be it. We put their airfields down from where their Air Force could respond to their cries, you know, out there. So the important thing is that the enemy Air Force air power must not be allowed to interfere with our land forces. That is the start point. ISR was one. The second part is don't allow the enemy air power to interfere with the land forces. Precisely what you saw, what you call a favorable air situation, and then air superiority and air dominance, what happened in the East in 1971.
Well, very well put, sir. Very well put, sir. I think at least I'm better educated, and I assume most of our viewers are better educated, having heard both of you today, into the complexities about what land-air coordination that goes into ensuring that even before the war has fully begun, the enemy is on the back foot. But more of that in one of another show of ours. I wish to thank you both and thank you for watching. Until our next episode, goodbye.